So it's good to be back. I am back in Melbourne for good. I come back with sort of mixed feelings. Things didn't really work out in Tassie. For those who know, I went down there. And I've been back now in Melbourne for about 2 months actually, and settling back in. One of the things we did in Tassie when I was there, I was part of a lovely little church community called City Baptist Church in Launceston. And one of the things they were doing was a course called Practicing the Way. If you're familiar with an author called John Mark Comer, he's an American guy, as a lot of these people are, and he's got this book called Practicing the Way, and it's about what you might imagine, practicing the way of following Jesus. What does it mean, and what does it look like to follow Jesus in our culture? And we were doing a course that followed this book through a workbook and so on, and we were gathering this small group of probably about only 4 or 5 of us each week. One of the things that we talked about one week was, what are some experiences, or what are times, and what are the things that have brought or triggered growth in your life? And I know for me, and I don't know, maybe it's the same for you as well, for me it's often been experiences of loss. And I've had that recently as well, and different periods over time, and I'm sure we've all had periods of loss in our life. Probably most of us have had periods of quite intense loss in our time as well, and they can trigger growth. It's often really only through those times of loss that we do grow. I remember when I was going through a divorce 13 years ago, I was speaking to a group of mainly young people at a church in Blackburn, and I said to them that if you haven't experienced intense loss in your life, you will. It's a very rare person who goes through life without experiencing intense loss. And I remember Smithy standing up here many years ago and saying life is really about how we deal with loss. We can become bitter and resentful, blame everyone, and often we do go through injustice. We have been wronged. Or we can, as Louise reminded us this morning, we can be grateful. In James, the opening lines of the letter of James say, "Count it all joy when you experience all kinds of trials." And you might think, well, what sort of masochist is this guy, James? But when you think about it, gratitude, and I was saying to Louise before, 2 people in 12-step programs talk about having an attitude of gratitude as part of their own recovery. And it helps them to stop drinking or using or whatever their drug of choice has been. And we see in today's reading people who have experienced loss. We see the father who's lost his daughter. And in Mark's Gospel, and this story is actually told in all 3 synoptic Gospels. The synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark and Luke, because they're quite similar and they all seem to borrow off each other. And Mark's Gospel actually links the story of the girl who's died and the woman with the flow of blood with the number 12. Mark says the girl who died was 12 years old, and we're told in Matthew as well that the woman with the flow of blood had that problem for 12 years. So there's a link there that's quite deliberate in the story. And to really understand these stories in the Gospels overall, and this one especially, we need to look at the context. And we look at firstly about the calling of Matthew in this Gospel. And it's important to see that the way Jesus operated, the way Jesus had his disciples, was very different to the way most rabbis in that time had disciples. Most rabbis in that time had people come up to them and ask to be worthy of being their disciple. But Jesus turned it all around and called people. If you wanted to become a disciple of a rabbi in that culture, you approached them, you made your case, you demonstrated your knowledge of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament. You wanted to demonstrate to them your commitment. It's a bit like a job interview. Demonstrate your commitment, your worthiness for the job. Please pick me. And the rabbi would assess you, and if he judged you as worthy, he might accept you. So the whole system was built on the idea that disciples sought out teachers, not the other way around. But Jesus turned that completely on its head. He walked up to Matthew and he issued the call, "Follow me." And this is where it gets scandalous. This is not just a nice story of Jesus calling this guy and this guy being obedient, but Matthew was a tax collector. Now, try and think of who are the most hated people in our society today. I don't know. Don't name names now, but you've probably got your own people or groups of people. I certainly do. But Jesus calls Matthew, this tax collector, who was one of the most despised figures in that society. And basically, tax collectors were Jewish people who were basically sold out to the Roman occupying forces. They would collect taxes on Rome's behalf, and they would often just get a bit on the side for themselves as well, so that they were known as being dishonest, being cheats, being frauds. So Matthew wasn't exactly a star candidate for Jesus. You might think, what's Jesus doing picking this sort of person to be one of his disciples? They were seen as collaborators and seen as traitors to their own people. Treason is a word that comes to mind. They chose money and Roman approval over solidarity with their own community. They'd sold out to their own people. I mean, you almost couldn't think of anything worse than such betrayal of your own people. Now, Jesus also, remember, was being watched. He was being watched constantly by the religious leaders of his time, by the Pharisees, Sadducees. And the people, the common people too, desperately hoped for a Messiah in that time. And a Messiah was a sort of figure who was going to be a liberator, and especially a liberator of the liberator from the occupying forces, the Romans. This Messiah would restore dignity and liberate the people. And so you can imagine what it was like when Jesus, as this Messiah type person, starts calling people like Matthew. I mean, you've chosen the wrong side, Jesus. That's what people would have thought. He's chosen Matthew over all the respectable, devout candidates. So it was actually quite a scandal. So we need to think of that in this story. When you look at the calling of Matthew, Matthew's gospel tells it actually quite matter-of-factly, and you sort of miss a bit of the scandal of it, really. He says that Jesus called Matthew got up and followed, end of story. He's got one more disciple. He goes and calls the rest of them. But then you have the story move to dinner at Matthew's place, and that's where things get really interesting. Because word gets around that Jesus is hanging out with people like Matthew's mates, other tax collectors and other sinners. And of course, the righteous religious people are outraged at all this. Sinners in that culture were people like prostitutes, people living in poverty, people considered ritually unclean, certain tradies are seen as dishonest, non-Jewish people, and sexually immoral people. Shepherds were also counted as sinners in that society as well. They had a reputation for being unreliable and being quite dodgy. Well, that might be a bit surprising. There were sort of people you crossed the road to avoid if you saw them coming towards you. The people that respectable society had written off. And eating with someone in that culture, going to their place for a meal, was actually quite a radical sign of acceptance. This is a sort of context we need to take into account to get the scandal and the offence of this story. It was a statement of acceptance to do that. It meant you were saying, this person is someone who I want to associate with. They belong with me. I'm happy to be part of them, part of their life, and I consider them worthy to be in my company. And so for Jesus to do that as this Messiah figure was just scandalous. So, as I was preparing this week, I thought I might have a think about what that might look like in Collingwood in 2026, the calling of Matthew and this story. So let's see what it might look like. As Jesus walked down Smith Street, he went into the local Centrelink office and spoke with a guy called Matt, who was helping people fill out forms. "Follow me," Jesus said. And Matt got up, left everything there, and followed him. Later, Jesus was having dinner at Matt's place in one of the old commission flats on Wellington Street, just over here. Word got around and people started showing up. A woman from the Needle Exchange in Johnston Street, a couple of guys from the housing estate who'd been done for possession, someone's cousin who'd been sleeping rough near the Yarra, and a sex worker who worked at a local brothel. They all pulled up a chair and Jesus sat down with them and ate with them. When the pastors from a couple of local churches heard what was going on, they were pretty offended. They took one of Jesus' mates aside and asked him, "What's he doing with people like that? What's he doing eating with people like that and hanging out with them?" But Jesus heard them and said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor. Go and work out what this means. I want mercy, not empty religion. I didn't come for the ones who think they've got it all together. I came for the ones who know they don't." Jesus is quoting Hosea here, Hosea 6:6 actually. And if you look through Matthew's Gospel, Matthew quotes a lot of the Old Testament a lot, because Matthew's Gospel was written to a Jewish audience. And so he wanted them to understand and to see how Jesus fits in, and Jesus meets all the criteria of the Messiah. And so when Jesus quotes that, "I want mercy, not sacrifice, or not empty religion," the Pharisees who were there would have known exactly what he meant. And they would have known that Jesus was issuing a direct challenge to them. He was saying, "You know your Bible, but you've got it all back to front. You've missed the whole point of it." Because the gospel isn't about keeping yourself clean. It's not about maintaining a careful distance from the wrong kind of people so your reputation stays intact. I think that's fear-based Christianity, and it's not Christian. It's not the gospel. The gospel is about mercy. Jesus said the whole law and the prophets is summed up in the command to do for others what you would want them to do for you. They're not woke words, they're the words of Jesus. It's about moving toward the people who are struggling, people the system has chewed up and spat out, and sitting with them. But then the story shifts. Jesus is mid-conversation with people, with all these sinners, and a man pushes through the crowd. He's probably well dressed, but he's visibly very upset, and he's clearly out of place amongst these sort of people. He's a synagogue ruler, a leader in the community, and he falls at Jesus' feet. He's so desperate. And he says, "My daughter has just died." Can you imagine the faith it would take? Say, "My daughter, she's actually died, but if you lay your hands on her, she'll live." That's incredible faith this guy showed. And elsewhere, Jesus says he's never seen such faith in all Israel when someone does the same sort of thing. And Jesus gets up, a bit like Matthew really. He gets up, just like that, and says he'll go and heal her. So again, if you think of it in this context in Collingwood in 2026, let's look at it this way. While Jesus was still talking, a man pushed through the crowd on Smith Street, well dressed, visibly upset, someone who clearly didn't normally come to this part of Melbourne. He dropped to his knees in front of Jesus, right there on the footpath. "My daughter has just died. She's gone. She's overdosed. Please just come." And Jesus gets up and goes with him. But as they move through the crowd, a woman comes closer to Jesus. She'd been bleeding internally for 12 years, undiagnosed for most of that time, dismissed by 3 different doctors, told it was all in her head, just dismissed, told it was anxiety, and she was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. You ever been told that by different doctors or people that They don't know what's wrong. There's nothing really wrong with you. You feel invalidated. That's what this woman would have felt like. But she didn't say anything. She just reached out and touched the sleeve of Jesus' jacket as he passed. And Jesus stopped, he turned around in the crowd and says, "Who touched me?" If you look at this story in Mark's Gospel, again you see the quite bizarre circumstances of this, where there's a whole crowd around Jesus, literally a crowd around him, and he turns around and says, "Who touched me?" Well, everyone's touching each other, everyone's brushing past each other and so on. And the disciples in that story in Mark say, "Well, what do you mean, who touched you?" But Jesus knows something has happened, and the woman knows as well. And then she steps forward, shaking. She says, "It was me. I'm sorry, I didn't know what else to do." Jesus says to her, "Don't be sorry." He looked at her properly. "You're going to be okay. What you just did took more courage than you know." And she felt it move through her body. Something had changed. After being dismissed by these doctors, all her money was gone. After all these years, something in her body had changed. Then continuing on the story in this context, when they got to the apartment in the commissioned flats, the paramedics were still there, and a neighbour was howling in the hallway, and someone else had called for a grief counsellor. People were standing around with that look that, it's over. She's gone. But Jesus says, "Clear the room." Someone said, "Mate, she's gone. We were here. She's dead." But Jesus ignores them. He walks past them into the bedroom, takes the girl's hand, and she opens her eyes. By the next morning, the talk about it goes around the whole estate. It's interesting, you look at it in that context. You try and think of it in how it might look today. And try and grab some of the scandal of it. Hanging out with, the not respectable people. I remember a friend of mine saying some years ago, "No wonder they killed Jesus." But let's go back to the woman with the flow of blood, because this is where we see what the gospel is really about. She's physically healed, but there's so much more going on with this woman's life. And again, if we look at what this woman was going through, we see that her whole sense of self was damaged, was broken. And we see how the gospel is not just about spiritual healing, it's about emotional healing, physical healing. The gospel encompasses all of life. In first century Jewish society, a woman who bled continuously like that was considered ritually unclean. If you look at the Jewish law in the Old Testament, she was untouchable. And anyone who touched her became unclean as well. And so Jesus touching her would normally have been considered unclean, but he turns all that around. As well as that, given the nature of her illness, having that bleeding, she was almost certainly divorced. A husband could divorce his wife in that culture for pretty much any reason they wanted to, really. Very patriarchal culture, society. Because she couldn't have had children, and so she would have been considered cursed in some way. She would have been considered to have done something wrong, to have disobeyed God in some way. So she would have been blamed, it was all her fault. That's how she would have been considered. It was a very honour and shame culture. And so the husband would have been under significant social pressure to get rid of her, to keep his own standing, to keep his own honour, because it would have been shameful to be with such a woman. And a divorced woman in that society had no safety net either. No welfare. She would have been dependent on the charity of others, which would have been minimal at best. And so she was almost certainly living in poverty as well. So divorced, living in poverty, and then ill for 12 years, told it was all in her head, dismissed. She was basically a social outcast, and she knew it, and others knew it. Others saw her like that, and she would have seen herself like that as well. You can imagine her walking through the crowd, probably bent over, probably looking down, because she had such a low sense of herself and self-esteem. But again, consider her faith. She doesn't just ask Jesus for help, or doesn't ask him at all. She doesn't even feel worthy to ask. She just wants to touch his cloak. And again, if you look at Mark's gospel story about this very story, she touches his cloak and then wants to run off and not be noticed. If you struggle with shame, you want to hide. Shame wants to hide in the shadows. If you look at the work of people like Brené Brown, social researcher, she talks about shame and vulnerability, how shame is this belief that I am not worthy, I'm a bad person, and you want to hide. That's what shame does. That's what this woman would have experienced, that shame. But in desperation, she reaches out and Jesus stops. And here's where it gets, again, very, very moving, because Jesus stops. He doesn't say, look, I'm on the way to heal someone who's actually died. Can't you see that? Come back later. He stops. Jesus, you notice in the Gospels, Jesus is never really hurried. He's never seen as too busy. He's always got time for the people who are broken, for the people who are really needy. He could have kept walking. He could have let the healing, could have healed her still, but let it happen quietly on the side. But he actually stops in the middle of the crowd. And what does he call her? What does he call this woman who's had the bleeding? Daughter. Yep, this woman who was an outcast, who considered herself and was considered by others to be less than. Jesus says, no, you're part of the family. I accept you totally for who you are. Daughter. Daughter. You're in. You're included. This is where the healing is of her very sense of self. Her very sense of identity is healed as well. Her sense of self, her sense of self-worth. Because the gospel covers every aspect of existence. My friend Jared McKenna says, if Jesus is not Lord of all, he is not Lord at all. If Jesus is not Lord of all, he is not Lord at all. So this woman is healed physically, she's healed emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. Every sense of the word, she's healed. And Jesus does it by calling her out in the middle of the crowd, not to shame her, but to honour her. You ever been honoured by someone, affirmed in front of other people? It's such a buzz. Makes you feel good. And that's a good thing. That one word, daughter, places her back inside the family where she belongs, where she's always belonged. She isn't cursed. She's not less than. She's a daughter. And he does that right in front of the religious leaders. Mother Teresa used to say that the greatest poverty is not so much material poverty, but the poverty of spirit, the poverty of loneliness, poverty of not belonging. I was saying during the break as well that the organisation I work for, I do NDIS support work, and we want to try and foster a sense of community and belonging in people, in clients. And even the word client, I'd like to use, sounds so impersonal. But the people that we have a relationship with. Because belonging is probably the deepest human need. And this is where I think churches often get it all backwards, because we emphasise belief, then behaviour, and then belonging, whereas Jesus does the opposite. He says you belong, then your behaviour can change from that when you're accepted for who you are, and belief is important, but belonging is more important. So people like Mother Teresa got that. She knew that the feeling of being invisible, that you don't matter, that no one sees you, no one hears you, that's probably the biggest need that we need to have fixed. And that's what Jesus heals in this woman, in this story. Her place in the community, her identity before God. She can literally walk tall. That's the wholeness of the gospel. That's the kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. So it's not just a physical miracle that we see in this story. It's a whole restoration of her personhood. And this matters for us today because there are people in our society who are carrying that same wound. We all carry wounds. You might be carrying it here this morning. You might not be bleeding physically. You might not be visibly suffering in any way that makes the news. But you might feel invisible to people around you. You might have been told that you don't matter by other people, by your family, by your own inner voice of shame. Might have told you that you don't matter, that you're too broken, that you're too disqualified. But the gospel says, no, you belong. You belong. You always have belonged. That's what it says. You're not too broken. You're not too disqualified from love. You're not invisible to God. Knowing that deep in your heart can give you the sort of resilience that you need to face life on life's terms. Louise mentioned before about research that talks about gratitude and what it does for our mental health. There's research that also shows that people who grow up with a secure sense of who they are, of acceptance, have far greater resilience during difficult times. Things like attachment theory, developmental psychology, neuroscience, they all converge on the same finding that being known and being loved doesn't just feel good, but it shapes who we are. It's good for our mental health and it's good for our relationships. It frees us to love other people because we know that we're loved. We don't have to play the games anymore. We don't have to try and prove ourselves because we have nothing to prove because we're already accepted. And so we can be free in that to love other people in that. It's sort of that paradox that we're fulfilled in giving to others. In giving ourselves away, we're not diminished, we're actually fulfilled. There's that paradox. Because it builds something in us that enables us to recover from setbacks, to get resilience, to face fear, to keep going when things are hard. So when Jesus calls this woman daughter, he's not just being nice and feel good. He's doing something that's deeply human and very, very powerful for her. He's giving her a foundation to live by. And that's the gospel. The gospel is the kingdom of God in Jesus on earth as it is in heaven. Not just about going to heaven when you die. It's good news now. As Christian Aid, an aid and development organisation from the UK, had a wonderful slogan many years ago. They said, "We believe in life before death." And I've always remembered that because it just hits hard. It's punchy and it says it all. We believe in life before death. Wholeness for the whole person. So this story ends not with a theological statement, but with a woman healed in every way, with a daughter waking up, and a whole community talking about it. And that's love. Love is when you're seen. You're really, really seen and heard for who you are. 2 weeks ago, I was up in Queensland at a men's gathering. And I might have mentioned this before, but it's something that I feel quite evangelistic about it because it impacts me so much. It's one of those gatherings where, as men, we're often, we struggle to talk about feelings, to say we love each other. A bit sheepish about that sometimes. So this gathering that I go to, and I'm part of a men's group here as well, we share, and it's about feeling heard. We don't try to fix each other. We just want to be heard, and we just hear each other. You can say you've had a great week or a crap week, and no one bats an eyelid, but you're heard, you're accepted for who you are. That's love. the kind that sees you. And this woman in this story with the flow of blood, she was seen and heard in every way. And that's the love that spreads. That's the reign of God spreading on earth as it is in heaven. Amen.